My name is Brennan Camp, and today I'll be presenting the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, written by Benjamin Franklin. Here we have a picture of Benjamin Franklin. He's called the first American because of his interest in so many different subjects. He was a jack of all trades. He was interested in philosophy, literature, science, politics, and he was also a very successful businessman. Another reason that he's called the first American is because he built himself from nothing. He came from a low social status, low financial status, and became one of the most politically influential and wealthiest men of his time. Benjamin Franklin was born on January 17th, 1706 in Boston, which was then part of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. He was very smart, and his parents had enrolled him in grammar school, but he had to drop out at the age of 10 to work in his father's shop. They wanted him to become a minister, but he had to come back home in order to support his family, which was struggling. He was very bored at the soap shop, however, and so at age 12, he took a contract with his brother and worked at his print shop. And his brother, James, was documented as having mistreated him very harshly, beating him, putting him down, suppressing him, so much so that whenever Franklin was first published, he actually did it under a pen name, that way his brother wouldn't find out, even though he eventually did and punished him for it. At 19, however, he was published for the first time as himself, under his own name, which is important. At 22, he opened his own print shop with a partner, and then soon after, they purchased the Pennsylvania Gazette, turning it into one of the most widely read newspapers and one of the most influential newspapers of the time. Also, it was the first to turn a profit in the colonies. He was very successful as he grew older. One such success is Poor Richard's Almanac, where it had a bunch of different information, short stories, quotes, quips, lunar calendars, just a collection of information basically. And he wrote it under the pen name of Richard. And a lot of the quotes and quips from those stories still survive to today and are quoted all the time. He was very interested in science in his later years, and he came up with several inventions and discoveries. One of the lesser known is swimming flippers, and he enjoyed swimming very much. In fact, whenever he went to Europe, he often swam in the English Channel. One of his most famous inventions, or discoveries rather, was electricity. He discovered that lightning was electric because of his famous kite and key experiment. Another thing is he invented bifocals for people who were both nearsighted and farsighted, which he was. He was elected to the Albany Assembly in the Second Continental Congress as a representative. He headed several government contracts, such as printing a lot of our nation's early currency, and he also was in charge of a couple of public works projects. He's credited with having created one of the first fire stations in America, and he also helped to fund a police force. He was the U.S. ambassador to France. He was at one time the Postmaster General, and most importantly, he helped draft the founding constitution of our country. This is a political cartoon that was featured in one of his newspapers. It basically said that the colonies needed to join together against the British, otherwise they would fall apart. It's important to mention that he was a patriot, which put him at odds with his loyalist son, as we'll later learn. Here's just a couple of pictures of his achievements. These are his personal pair of bifocals, which are currently in a museum. Here's a painting of his famous kite experiment. And then here is a copy of Poor Richard's Almanac from 1733. The plot of his story is basically the story of his life, and it's divided into 4 parts. Part 1 was written before the American Revolution. It opens as a letter to his son William, and as I said before, they had a disagreement because while Benjamin Franklin was a patriot, his son William was a loyalist, and it made them very angry with each other for obvious reasons. He says that he wrote the book in order to guide the future and help others improve themselves. He kind of wants this to be like a self-help guide, but rather than giving you steps, he gives you an example. Self-improvement is a major theme, which I'll get to it later on. Part 2 is written from France after the Revolution, He's a deist, and he outlines what he believes are the 13 great virtues, the 13 things that make somebody a good person. He tries to sound humble in his writings, but sometimes he does a little humble brag, and he likes to say what he's done. He states that he respects all religions, which is important at this time because the reason that the Puritans came to America is because they were being oppressed. There was a lot of religious persecution throughout history, and he's one of our founding fathers, so it's important that he was, respectful of all different types. The plot for parts 3 and 4. Part 3 was written after he moved back to America, and it was also after his wife died. He describes his idea for a new political party known as the Party for Virtue. In this, he created his own idea for a political party, but it never actually came to fruition. But it's worth mentioning because it was a good idea. His respect for Native Americans is very notable, as during the time there was a lot of people calling them savages, as we read in our class. But he, kind of fired them up for that and was like, no, we're kind of acting like the savages in this case. And during this part of his life, part 3, kind of in part 2, but in part 3 mainly, is when he becomes a financial, scientific, intellectual, and political success. This is whenever he becomes the founding father that we know him as on the $100 bill. In part 3, he's kind of bragging on himself. He's, stating all the good things he's done, all the achievements he's made. Part 4 is the shortest part, and it's written after the events in London, where he goes to defend the colonial rights. He wants to be, they want to be recognized by Britain, who refuses, denies, and mistreats them. And he gets really, really resentful towards the crown. He dies before he's able to finish the autobiography, which I think is important and interesting because, maybe he wanted to take out some things, maybe he wanted to add some things. This book that we read as his autobiography, they're his words, but we don't know if that's the whole thing, The major characters, it's an autobiography, so obviously the major characters are going to be the major people in his life, his family, his friends, and himself. Firstly, we have Benjamin Franklin. Secondly, I mentioned his parents, Josiah and Abiah Franklin. Josiah is the one that owned the soap shop. Franklin's son, William, was the one that he was a loyalist, and they had a lot of disagreements. William Franklin actually ended up becoming a governor, but they didn't really talk. James Franklin was his brother that owned the print shop, and like I said, he mistreated him, and they didn't get along for the majority of their lives, but eventually they kind of reconciled. Deborah Reed was his wife, and then Samuel Keimer was an employer, and then later kind of a business associate. This was during a couple of different important historical eras. Firstly, the Revolutionary era was America's fight for freedom. The slavery and abolitionary era, this was mainly before the big abolitionist movement, but it's worth mentioning because Benjamin Franklin actually owned slaves early on in his life, but he, realized this is an evil system, this isn't what I want to be a part of, so he freed his slaves and became a staunch abolitionist. This is also during the Constitutional era where America's new government is being formed. And it's during a couple of different wars. He includes the Revolutionary War and the French and Indian War, of which he was a part. This is also during a couple of important cultural eras. New ideas of independence and personal liberty are growing. This is the first time that we're seeing people want freedom in such a way. And he, as a patriot, was obviously somebody that was very pro-freedom. There's a quote from him that says, who would sacrifice freedom for a moment of temporary safety deserves neither and would lose both, which is a quote that I like from him. The American dream ideal is first perpetuated by his life. Benjamin Franklin worked from nothing to become very, very influential, as I mentioned. And it's kind of like a little Cinderella story, which is important. There's also during this time the Great Awakening, which I think influenced his religious beliefs. And slavery and abolition wasn't just a historical era, it was also a cultural era. The economics of the time. This is kind of whenever America started to shift from a cottage economy to having sawmill companies, fishing fleets, printing companies, these, not modern corporations, but they're getting there. And his success was part of this. It's also worth mentioning that there was, at the time, free trade between the colonies and then later the states, which helped foster this economic growth and this transition. There's a couple of different literary devices that he uses, and I've chosen 4. First, the understatement. In order to appear humble, he downplays his role, like the public library creation. He kind of downplays his role whenever he was like one of the main people in charge of it, but he just kind of puts it down. He uses satire and sarcasm, because whenever he says that he wants to be, a near perfect man, he's kind of satirizing the ideal that men could become perfect. There's also symbolism. He symbolizes the library that he created is kind of a symbol of what he wants to perpetuate, which is self-improvement. You don't go to a library to have somebody teach you usually. You go to a library to read and learn for yourself, which is what he did all his life, and what he wants us to do by reading his book. He also alludes several times to the Bible and other books, and he kind of quotes himself from Poor Richard's Almanac a couple times. Like I said before, the theme of this book is self-improvement. He wants to show that through hard work and focused dedication, you can overcome your humble beginnings to become great, just as he did. There's also large undertones of charity and service, which are very important to him and which are really consistent with his Freemason teachings. A little fact about him is that he was, at one time, the Grand Master of Philadelphia Freemasonry. And my personal evaluation is that I enjoyed reading this book. I've always found Benjamin Franklin to be a very important and interesting and historical figure. He's very, very smart, very, very wise. And that's why his quotes and different things are still talked about today. He accomplished the goal of his book, in my opinion, because he's guiding and showing others the possibilities that can come from hard work. And I would recommend this just for the Cinderella story value, as well as the historical and cultural significance. This is a great book of literary significance because it's one of the few that really stand out. Unless you're looking at Frederick Douglass or Harriet Jacobs, there's not really a whole bunch of autobiographies that have such a great impact upon the reader. It's not just an autobiography, but it's also a story of the American dream. It's a story of our founding. It's a story of so many different important things that were going on during the time. It's just really an important book to me. That's all I've got for Benjamin Franklin. Here's a picture of him. He's a great guy and a great book.